Welcome back to the courtroom. I'm Darell Caldwell. In episode 1, we filed the indictment. Race is a fiction, codified by law, maintained by political symbiosis, and ripe for abolition. Today, we begin the testimony. We start with the largest box on the census form, the one that, as of the 2020 census, over 200 million Americans checked. White. You would think that the category containing the majority of the population would be clearly defined. You would be wrong. The prosecution would demonstrate that the definition of white has changed over time, excludes people who are treated as white, includes people who reject whiteness, and is ultimately based not on science, but on administrative convenience and political alliance. Let us begin. The Office of Management and Budget, which controls all federal racial categories, defines white as follows: a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. The Middle East, North Africa. According to the federal government, a person from Cairo, Egypt, a city in North Africa, is white. A person from Tehran, Iran, in the Middle East, is white. A person from Beirut, Lebanon, also white. For decades, many people from these regions have rejected this classification. Why? Because they are not treated as white, not by police, not by employers, not by airport security, not by neighbors who see their name or hear their accent. The government told them they were white. Life told them they were not. The contradiction is not an accident. It is a design flaw in the classification system. To understand why the definition of white is incoherent, we must look at who was not white and then became white. Consider the Irish. In the 19th century, Irish immigrants to the United States were depicted in political cartoons as ape-like, simian, separate from the Anglo-Saxon race. They were not considered white in the same way as English or German immigrants. Then, over decades, they became white. Not because their DNA changed, because they assimilated into the labor market, the Catholic Church, and the Democratic Party. They earned whiteness through political and social struggle. The same pattern holds for Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Jewish Americans, Greek Americans. Each group was once excluded from whiteness. Each group eventually included. What does this prove? Whiteness is not a biological ancestry. It is a status that can be granted, withheld, and later granted again based on social consensus and political power. And if whiteness is a status, not a stable biological category, then the government has no business defining it. Now, the prosecution introduces a piece of historical evidence that is rarely discussed in American classrooms. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany codified the most infamous racial hierarchy in modern history. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 defined who was Jewish, who was Aryan, and who was subhuman. The Nazis believed in a biological hierarchy with the Nordic Aryans at the top. Then came World War II, and Japan became a crucial ally of Nazi Germany. There was a problem. The Japanese were not European. They were not Nordic. By Nazi racial science, they were not Aryan. They were, by definition, a lower race. But geopolitics demanded alliance. So Nazi Germany did something that reveals the true nature of race. They changed the definition. In 1936, Nazi officials declared that the Japanese were honorary Aryans. This was not a scientific finding. No new evidence about Japanese genetics had emerged. It was a diplomatic convenience. Japan was useful. Therefore, Japan was reclassified. Let the prosecution repeat that. An entire racial category was rewritten at a desk in Berlin because of a treaty. The Japanese were not European. They were not white, but they were granted Aryan status for the duration of the war. After the war, the classification quietly disappeared. What does this prove? Race is not biology. Race is a tool of statecraft. When the state needs to include someone, it invents a new category. When it needs to exclude someone, it invents a different category. If the Nazi regime, the most race-obsessed government in history, could change its racial classifications for political convenience, then the American system is not exceptional. It is the same machinery. In the MENA controversy, rejected in 1977 and 1997, accepted in 2024, is merely a milder version of the same phenomenon. Now, let us return to the MENA populations, the ones the government classified as white against their will. In the 1970s and 1980s, Arab Americans and Iranian American organizations began petitioning the OMB to create a separate Middle Eastern or North African category. They argued that the discrimination against them was not captured by the white box. They argued that their heritage, culture, and identity were distinct. The OMB refused. In 1977, when Directive 15 was first issued, MENA was rejected. The reason? Administrative convenience. Adding a category would change the population counts. Redistricting formulas would be disrupted. Civil rights enforcement would have to be recalibrated. In 1997, during the next revision, MENA was rejected again. Same reasons. Then, in 2024, after decades of advocacy, OMB finally added a MENA category. The evidence was the same. The discrimination was the same. The population had not changed. What changed? Political pressure. The balance of power shifted. Advocacy groups grew stronger. The Census Bureau realized that 15% of respondents were checking some other race, and they needed to reduce that number. The prosecution's point is not that the MENA category is wrong. The point is that the rejection and eventual acceptance prove the entire system is arbitrary. If the same evidence justified exclusion in 1997 and inclusion in 2024, then the categories are not measuring anything stable. They are measuring the balance of political influence. Sound familiar? It is the same logic as Nazi Germany granting honorary Aryan status to Japan. Race is a diplomatic tool, always has been. Here is an irony the prosecution wants you to consider. When the OMB announced the new MENA category, some white commentators objected. They said that adding a separate category would reduce the white population and dilute white political power. Let us pause to appreciate this argument. For decades, MENA populations were told they were white. They said, "We are not white. We do not identify as white. We are not treated as white." Now, when the government finally listens, some white voices say, "You can't leave whiteness. Whiteness needs your numbers." The prosecution submits that this is the clearest evidence yet that whiteness is a political coalition, not a biological reality. It is a coalition that fears losing members. It is a coalition that includes people who do not want to be included and excludes people who want to join. A biological race does not worry about its population count. A biological race does not lose sleep over who identifies with it. A biological race does not grant honorary membership to its allies in a war. Only a social construct does that. Now the prosecution asks the jury to consider a simple question. If the government cannot define white with any consistency, if the definition has changed over time, if it has included people who rejected it and excluded people who claimed it, if it has been revised based on political pressure rather than scientific discovery, if the Nazi regime could grant honorary Aryan status to the Japanese for diplomatic convenience, then on what authority does the government ask any citizen to check that box? The answer is no authority, only habit, only inertia, only the convenience of bureaucrats who do not want to redesign the forms. The prosecution does not ask you to be angry. Anger is not evidence. The prosecution asks you to see the pattern. The pattern is this: the boxes are not real. They are administrative artifacts, sometimes shaped by geopolitics, and they have no legitimate claim on your identity or your government. In our next episode, we will examine the other end of the ledger. What is Black? We will explore the one-drop rule, the ideological gatekeeping that can revoke Blackness for wrongthink, and the circular definition that defines Black by Black racial groups. But for today, the prosecution rests on count 2. The definition of white is arbitrary. The history of whiteness is a history of social status, not biology. The MENA controversy proves that the government changes categories when pressured, not when evidence demands. And the Nazi-Japanese alliance proves that race can be rewritten for diplomatic convenience. If the largest racial category in the United States cannot be defined with scientific or logical coherence, and if it can be redefined at a desk in Berlin or Washington, then the entire classification system collapses. And that collapse is not a tragedy. It is an opportunity. Court will reconvene for episode 3. What is Black?